All right, we're going to jump back into chapter 21, and we're definitely now moving more towards the physiology side. This is the portion that people are going to have questions over. I envision this being much more what we talk about on Thursday. So I did go through and actually read this chapter since this is a new textbook. And the interesting thing is, just like our question the other day on the heart with like sodium and calcium, this book is explaining a couple things, I would say fairly differently. And so I think this is a good one to cover. A couple things that they were saying I found to be fairly confusing the way maybe they were written. So we definitely have some stuff to cover here. So we left off here looking at the distribution of blood throughout the body, right? And so just a reminder, a majority of this is in the veins. Again, they have higher capitance, right? Stretchability. Your book actually had a really good example. The veins are much more like a balloon. So if you tried to put water in a cup and in a balloon, right, you could put much more into the balloon. It would stretch out. It has, capitance. Okay, so then when we start looking at how this system works, what we're still going to talk about the vessels a little bit, and then we're going to come full circle because we definitely have to include the heart as well when we jump into regulation. But let's look at this first. Now, I will say there's some physics here, right? So don't let it throw you. Don't get too worried when there's equations. I think we can make this all make sense. So one of the big things that you should definitely be taking away from this chapter, and I suppose it kind of had an equation. So let's see if we can figure this out. They talk about how blood flow, so they used an F. They say blood flow is proportional, that's what that symbol is, to, they said pressure 1 minus pressure 2. So delta is change. So delta P, the change in pressure, if you want pressure 1 minus pressure 2, that's fine, over resistance. Okay, so this is one of those examples where there is an equation, right? But then let's think about it. What we're looking at here is what causes blood to flow. And what this equation really says is that the change in pressure needs to overcome the resistance. Okay, so this is a great example here, right? So this graph over here, right, is showing us blood pressure. So notice that the pressure is highest in the aorta and then it drops across the entire cardiovascular system. Blood flows from areas of high pressure to lower pressure. And so what we're doing in the cardiovascular system, the heart is exerting this huge force to get a high pressure in the aorta so that it will then flow into the arteries, which then flows into the arterioles, to the capillaries and on, right? So we just are making it so pressure 1, right, up here is greater than pressure 2, right? So we have a change in pressure. It wants to go from high to low. And as long as that's a big enough difference to overcome the resistance of the vessels, then we get blood flow, okay? And big picture, we need blood flow, right? You only get blood flow to your liver if the pressure in the capillaries in the liver is lower than in the arteries, right? It's just going to pour in there, okay? So don't let that equation throw you. It's just saying that the change in pressure needs to overcome the resistance. So if we have higher resistance, if we start getting clogged arteries and things like that, it just means that we need to up the change in pressure, right? So the heart is essentially going to work harder. Okay, let's look at, again, this is from the previous textbook, but I thought this was really interesting. So notice what happens here. Basically, what explains this drop in blood pressure across the system. So what we'll see diameter-wise, right, and this should make sense from the last video, right? The elastic arteries are really big. The vena cava, for example, is a huge vein, right? The capillary diameter is extremely small. So we see changes in the diameter, but more importantly, right, the cross-sectional area. There's only one aorta. And so it actually makes up a very little cross-sectional area of the cardiovascular system. It's the capillaries, right, that are super dominant here. And so one of the things that we're going to see is that blood flow slows down according to that cross-sectional area. And so blood actually ends up going slowly through the capillaries. This is actually super important for exchange. And by slow, it's not like slow, right? But compared to how it's moving through the aorta, the blood flow slows down in the capillaries, giving us time to exchange things like CO2 and carbon dioxide. All right. Okay. So, and then how did I want to, okay. So then if you think about blood pressure, right? Again, the heart is pumping. So we have a huge diameter vessel, though it's not much of the cross-sectional area. We have a huge pressure there. As the vessels are kind of expanding out into the capillaries, right, that huge area is going to be part of what lets the capillaries have this lower and lower blood pressure. They don't really then recover that pressure, right? As you move into the larger veins, there's no pump really behind that, right? There's not another heart that drives the venous system. So as the diameter increases and there's no pump behind it, that pressure stays really low. And so we continue to dump blood to lower pressure until we actually get into the right atrium. Hopefully that made sense. Okay. Okay. Blood flow. We need the blood to flow from high pressure to low pressure. Okay. Okay. Resistance. So let's think about this value for a little bit, right? Because the pressure really has to do with the heart. And so if we have higher resistance, we're going to make the heart work harder to overcome it. So let's talk a little bit about resistance. And again, this is physics, but if we take it, it's okay. We're going to be okay. So when we look at total peripheral resistance, we have three factors: vascular resistance, blood viscosity, and turbulence. Okay, so this first panel up here is looking at what's going on with vascular resistance, right? One of our three factors affecting total peripheral resistance. Now, okay, a couple things affect vascular resistance. Vessel length makes a difference, right? If you have a vessel that is twice as long, right, you get twice the resistance. Now, this doesn't really matter to us that much because you can't change the length of your blood vessels. They've probably lengthened as you've grown, and so there might be changes to vascular resistance there, but then it doesn't change. But it does get interesting, right, when we look at this next factor, which is the diameter of the blood vessel. So when blood flows through a capillary, right, it's just like water flowing through a pipe. And basically what's happening here is the blood that's along this outside edge is experiencing friction, right? It's actually rubbing on the edge of the blood vessel. And so the next layer of blood in has less friction because it's not actually touching the wall, but it is touching that blood that got slowed down. But by the time you get into the middle of this blood vessel, right, the blood is flowing the fastest. So blood is going to flow fastest down the center of a vessel. So now the diameter makes a big difference, right? Because if I made this blood vessel narrower, we have, like less of a, I don't know, it's like the highway, right? You get that, the special toll lane, you can go right down the middle and just fly past everyone. But then if we squeeze it down to 2 lanes, right, there's more friction. I don't know if that analogy works. Now, with the laws of physics, this is actually a really big change. So while increasing the length of a vessel twofold doubles the resistance, if you change the diameter, right, if you cut the diameter of a blood vessel in half, you actually increase that resistance 16 times, right? So notice right here, we had a vessel that was 2 centimeters. We cut that diameter in half. And now instead of doubling the resistance, it's actually a 16-fold increase. This again, if you want the math, what we see here is this resistance is proportional to 1 over the radius. Radius is half of the diameter to the 4th. That is a 4. Right? And so as we cut that in half, we went 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8 times 2 is 16. Little math for you there, okay? Big picture for you, the diameter of a blood vessel makes a huge difference in the resistance. And again, if we want blood to flow, the change in pressure needs to overcome the resistance. So anytime you're vasoconstricting, right, we're going to have to up the force from the heart. So someone who's getting atherosclerosis, their vessels are starting to clog, right? As they get narrower, that's going to increase this resistance. If someone is constantly like stressed and under this vasomotor tone, right, sympathetic stimulation, vasoconstriction, the heart has to work harder to overcome that. Okay, so the diameter of a blood vessel ends up making a big difference. And so the arterioles with all that little smooth muscle are going to make a huge difference in this. Okay, so total peripheral resistance, we had vascular resistance, and that had a couple factors here. Turbulence also plays a role. So basically, the easiest way for a fluid to flow is through what we call laminar flow. Nice, smooth flow like they're showing up here. The one lane kind of scoots right past the next, less friction towards the center. If you hit any bumps in the road, you get all these eddies and swirls. That's the turbulence. Excuse me. That's going to increase resistance as well. So this example they're showing there is this plaque deposit like you might see in atherosclerosis. Typically, this turbulence is a result of some sort of endothelial damage and then that inflammatory response following it, etc. Okay, so as you start to damage the endothelium, say smoking cigarettes, that damage is going to start to lead to turbulence, and turbulence increases the total peripheral resistance that we need to overcome. The last one there, and I don't have a picture of it, right? So again, let me see. Vascular resistance, turbulence, and viscosity. We'll put it over here. Viscosity. Wow, definitely can't write with a trackpad. Viscosity. You can spell it. Okay, so viscosity is how thick the blood is, right? Or motor oil or whatever you're dealing with. And so what we'll see in blood is the hematocrit is reflective of the viscosity. So having a higher hematocrit means you have more red blood cells as the fraction of your blood. So there's less plasma, right? And so it's thicker, it's sludgier. And so you can hit, right, if say 45% is a normal hematocrit. If you move to high altitude, right, you get more red blood cells and your hematocrit rises, your blood becomes a little more viscous. Okay, it's appropriate because you're able to carry the oxygen you need, but you are increasing the resistance. And so the change in pressure needs to overcome that. Okay, so mean arterial pressure. So this was definitely an area that I don't love the way they covered it. Okay, so mean arterial pressure is a real value. The way your text is talking about it, they are talking about mean arterial pressure really being this relationship between things like heart rate and stroke volume, which together is cardiac output, and then total peripheral resistance. But they wrote it as an equation with like multiplication symbols, and it's not a straight, to my understanding, it is not a straight like multiplication problem. If you actually wanted to figure out the mean arterial pressure, right? They're actually showing it on this graph, right? So they're showing systolic blood pressure, right? And if you're taking someone's blood pressure, their blood pressure cuff sphygmomanometer, right? 120/80 would be totally normal. 120 is when the heart is in systole, right? When it's contracting. And then 80 would be the blood pressure during diastole, right? It drops off dramatically. Notice that mean arterial pressure is somewhere in between those, and it's more like 2/3 of systolic pressure, right? It's not right down the middle. And technically, if you want to calculate mean arterial pressure, which I know you do, actually my understanding is that you don't actually have to do this math because the cart that the patient is going to be hooked up to is going to tell you the mean arterial pressure, but I want you to understand where it comes from, right? So basically the way you would actually calculate this is you take the diastolic blood pressure, right? So 80 in this case, and you are going to add the pulse pressure, which they're showing you on here, which is systolic minus diastolic blood pressure, right? So I'm just going to use an S minus a D. Again, so if they're 120/80, 120 minus 80, that's 40. This is not a big deal, right? And then you are going to divide it by 3, right? And that gives you the actual pressure for mean arterial pressure. Now, don't let the math throw you. Technically, a computer is going to do it for you. You should have an understanding that it's going to fall somewhere between systolic and diastolic pressure. But the big picture, why we care about mean arterial pressure, is it tells us something about perfusion, right? We need enough pressure to overcome the resistance to get blood flow. So mean arterial pressure is really a measurement that tells us if we're actually able to perfuse our organs. Okay? Yeah, I didn't love the way that your book handled that. Okay. Again, questions on Thursday, absolutely expecting them. Okay. If we talk about the regulation of the cardiovascular system, I pulled this from another book and we'll jump back to the way your book talks about it. But again, this idea that the blood vessels are going to attempt autoregulation. The vessels are going to try to fix whatever is out of whack with homeostasis. They try to fix it themselves. And then if that doesn't work, the endocrine system and the nervous system step in and help things out. Now, the way that your book talked about it, and I actually did, I did like this, right? They pointed out kind of after, well, let's do autoregulation, I guess, first. When they talked about endocrine and neural, they talked about long-term regulation, right? The endocrine system, and short-term regulation by the nervous system. And that kind of makes sense with our kind of compare contrast of the nervous and endocrine system. So short-term and long-term, I thought that was kind of a neat way to handle it. So let's talk about autoregulation real quick, and then and I think, yeah, we want this slide. So autoregulation, this is actually happening at the blood vessels. And so what we're going to see is that we're changing the pattern of blood flow inside this capillary bed. So we talked about all those precapillary sphincters and how they can open and let blood in, or they can kind of close off here. And so what we'll see is that things like increased levels of CO2, right, from active metabolizing cells, or decreased levels of an oxygen are actually going to affect those precapillary sphincters. Things like lactic acid, the change in pH, right? Lactic acid would be a byproduct of anaerobic cellular respiration. So we know the cell is working hard and it didn't have enough oxygen. That's also going to change blood flow through these beds. Things like temperature. As you're starting to work harder and there's more heat, that will open up this capillary bed. So we've got these cool little just slight changes in blood chemistry, temperature, things like that, that right at the local level where it's needed, we can see changes in blood flow through a capillary bed. Also, I guess under autoregulation, you could think about even what we saw in hemostasis, right? So little chemical mediators that are being released from platelets, right, causing vasoconstriction, that sort, or the damaged endothelium causing vasoconstriction. That would be an example of autoregulation. We're changing it right there. Okay, If autoregulation, right, is unable to restore homeostasis, then we're going to move over to how the endocrine system or the nervous system might jump in. And I'll go ahead and look at kind of how your book addressed that. So they said, hey, there's this short-term regulation. If you want a quick short-term solution, it's the nervous system, right? And so here we're going to see a few different things. So stick with me on short-term regulation. Here we're looking at baroreceptors, and we talked about these guys last time, right? They're in chapter 20. They're looking at changes in blood pressure, and they are located in the carotid sinus and the aortic sinus, right? BS, baroreceptors are in the sinuses. And so they're showing them right here. They are picking up sensory information about changes in blood pressure, right? And they are sending that back to the brain, in particular to the medulla, just like we saw when we were dealing with the heart. So the medulla oblongata houses not only the cardioregulatory center that we saw in the heart chapter, but also what's called the vasomotor center, right? So vasovessel, motor, think about the muscle that's involved there. And so what we're going to see here is as we get this feedback about how blood pressure is changing, this vasomotor center and cardioregulatory center, right, are going to decide what needs to happen, what needs to change, not only at the heart, right, at the SA node, but also down here in the blood vessels, right? So, so in this case, did they give us a direction? Okay, so let's say blood pressure was getting too high. We send that message back, right? We can use yeah, that would work. We could use parasympathetic innervation of the heart to say decrease heart rate. That would eventually decrease blood pressure. And then that vasomotor center would actually basically just turn down the sympathetic innervation of the blood vessels. So this is a little strange to think about. We don't really think about sympathetic versus parasympathetic in the blood vessels. They're basically innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. And then we either just like turn that up or turn it down. Okay, so turning it up is going to be vasoconstriction, right? Increasing blood pressure. If we turn down the sympathetic stimulation, that's going to give us vasodilation. So it's, they're not like antagonists of each other. It's just like you have a dial and you're adjusting what we call that vasomotor tone. Okay, so both of those systems can actually work together, right? Both the heart and the blood vessels could work together to say bring down blood pressure or increase it if that needed to happen. So that's a short-term response. This is a reflex, right? The baroreceptor reflex. We'll also, okay, if we look at the chemoreceptor reflex, and I should say the baroreceptor reflex is really like a day-to-day, we can make slight adjustments. These chemoreceptor reflexes are much more of like an emergency situation. So we're going to be using the same receptors we saw last week, the carotid and aortic bodies, right? And these are looking at things like oxygen, CO2, and pH, right? That's the chemicals that we're looking for with these sensory receptors. Okay, so what we can do here again is they're sending that information back to the medulla oblongata. We're informing the vasomotor center and the cardioregulatory center. So again, we can change this whole system together. These two really, right? It's the cardiovascular system. It's the heart and the blood vessels. Everyone works together. Okay, so if we run into this situation, right, decreased oxygen, increased CO2, pH, right, we know our tissues aren't getting enough oxygen. Okay, so what we're going to do, right, is actually stimulate. We decrease the parasympathetic innervation of the heart to actually increase the heart rate. Okay, that's our cardioregulatory center. And then we're going to increase the sympathetic same thing, sorry, that's doing stroke volume now. So we're increasing cardiac output, both heart rate and stroke volume. Here we go. Here's our blood vessels, right? Again, we are going to increase the sympathetic stimulation of our blood vessels, get some vasoconstriction. Okay. Now, one other thing that comes in here, right? You go, well, if you constrict it, that decreases blood flow. We have to think about where some of these things happen too. So, for example, you may want to constrict, if like the brain is finding out, I don't have enough oxygen, you actually may want to constrict blood vessels, say in the skin or the skeletal muscle, right? And send the oxygen elsewhere. So we'll see that it's actually a little more complicated than this, but that's the main idea. Okay, so this is the chemoreceptor reflex. We also have, the book points out the adrenal medulla. So again, the hypothalamus can use that neuron, trigger the adrenal medulla to dump all that epinephrine, norepinephrine, dramatically increase heart rate, stroke volume, and those are also going to act as vasoconstrictors. Okay, so we can use that. And again, that's constricting in things like the skin, in the viscera, right? In that case, right, it's a fight or flight response. You want to send a ton of blood flow to, say, the skeletal muscles. Other one they mentioned, it's called the CNS ischemic response. And this would be a really bad emergency, a really bad situation, right? So if the medulla stops getting enough oxygen to its own cells, that is when you would have this CNS ischemic response. Ischemia is that decrease in blood flow. And so the brain is going, wait, this is a problem. We need the blood flow. And so you get this immediate vasoconstriction to help up the blood pressure and try to drive blood up to the brain. But that would be a really bad situation. And if it doesn't work, or if it goes on long enough, right, without being corrected, then eventually with low oxygen levels, the medulla is going to die, and then you lose that reflex anyway, and then you actually die. Isn't that exciting? Okay. Let's see. So then, this is a graph from the previous book, and I kind of like this one too. So this one is baroreceptor reflex. And the reason I wanted to point this out, so you have this now on Canvas if you want to look at it, I really like the way, right? So here's their example. You have increasing blood pressure. Our baroreceptors are getting that stimulus, and they're sending the information back to the medulla. And they point out that there's this cardiovascular center or cardioregulatory center and the vasomotor center. And they're kind of showing what's happening at both, what happens in the heart and the blood vessel homeostasis is restored. So if this makes more sense to you, feel free to use it. I liked how they kind of put it all together. They did the same thing for chemoreceptors. Here's what happens in the cardiovascular center. Here's the vasomotor center. And so those results. Okay, so then the long-term regulation of the heart really goes back to the endocrine system. So we have a few different hormones that are going to end up playing a role here. Okay, I wanted to go to this slide. So the first one, this is hugely important. You are going to see this over and over again. So let's get this down. So this is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAS. Renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Okay, so if the kidney is getting a decreased amount of oxygen, right, there's a loss of blood pressure, a loss of blood flow to the kidney, it secretes a hormone called renin, or renin, same thing. This renin is going to act on an inactive protein that's made by the liver, out circulating in the blood all the time. This is angiotensinogen. Anytime you see that OGE ending, it is an inactive protein. Renin's going to change that. It's going to rip a part of it off, activate it. It becomes angiotensin 1. So renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Okay, that's now circulating through the blood, and it comes across an enzyme called ACE, right? Angiotensin converting enzyme, abbreviated ACE. And so you will talk about drugs called ACE inhibitors. This is the enzyme we're talking about. So ACE converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor, right? So it can act to increase blood pressure that way, right? We started because the kidney noticed that we had a decrease in blood pressure and wasn't getting enough oxygen, right? And so we go through this whole chain of events. Angiotensin II causes vasoconstriction to return blood flow to the kidney. Angiotensin II also triggers the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, and aldosterone tells the kidney to retain sodium. Water follows that. We increase blood volume, we increase blood pressure. Okay. I like this picture because they did it like as a flow chart. If it makes more sense to you, like you could totally, I can't do it on here, right? But you could take like angiotensinogen, write that out, show the reaction where it's converted to angiotensin 1, right? And you could point out that it's actually renin that makes that conversion. Angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2. I would write that out. And the enzyme here is ACE. Right, so if it would make more sense in like a left to right fashion, feel free, right? This was angiotensin 2. Ooh, I could do a 1. I can write a 1 and pull off a 2, right? And then you could point out, hey, you know, this is a vasoconstrictor. Oh, I could just put the arrow up there, right? It's a vasoconstrictor, and my arrows are getting weird, right? It triggers the release of aldosterone. Wow, so many A's. Aldosterone. Okay, so if it makes more sense left to right, rewrite it. But I thought this was a really nice image. So renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAS, right, is upping blood pressure. And again, this is a fairly regular, this is not an emergency situation. This is kind of working all the time. Another hormone that is constantly being adjusted to adjust blood pressure is our friend ADH. It's kind of nice. We're tying the endocrine system in here, right? And ADH is going to act on the kidney to have it reabsorb water. So it's working in conjunction with aldosterone. So you'll see RAS and ADH release happening together. On the flip side, I don't have a chart, or I don't have a picture of it, so I guess we're going to do it here. Right, so this is ADH up here. There's another hormone, and I don't think we really talked about it at all, called ANP, arterial natriuretic peptide. There's another very closely related molecule called BNP. It's brain natriuretic peptide. They're actually both released by the atria, so that's kind of a weird setup. But these natriuretic peptides are released when the heart gets overfilled. So if blood pressure is high, right, blood volume is high, blood pressure is high, and the heart stretches, the cardiac cells leak this atrial natriuretic or brain natriuretic peptide, and that is actually going to counteract antidiuretic hormone, right? Inhibit its release and tell us to pee out those excess fluids. So ANP actually is an antagonist. It works in the opposite direction. The last long-term regulation I was going to mention is this idea of fluid shift. So remembering that we have intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid, if blood pressure is rising because blood volume is getting really high, osmosis is going to try to force that out of the bloodstream, maybe into the interstitial fluid, and then even eventually into the cells. And so some of that can be like a long-term reaction to high blood pressure, is forcing that water out into the tissues, right, to take some of that pressure off the heart. So long-term regulation, short-term regulation, again, whichever of these pictures makes the most sense to you. This one is going through antidiuretic hormone, there's angiotensin, those sorts of things. I guess I would put that under one. Oh, let's do that. One more long-term response. Your book didn't even mention this. That's crazy. EPO, erythropoietin. So again, if the kidney is noticing low blood pressure, right, low oxygen levels coming to the kidney, one of the other responses could be release the hormone erythropoietin, which tells us to increase red blood cell formation, right? And so that's going to increase our blood volume and fix our blood pressure issue again. Now I'm looking to see if they left anything else out. I think we got it. Okay. Hopefully that helped. Hopefully it makes sense. Again, don't get lost in what look like math equations. You really need to understand more of that big picture. We want blood to flow, right? We want it to be a high enough pressure to actually perfuse the organs, to deliver oxygen, say, to the liver or some other organ cell. Okay, we will see you on Thursday. Enjoy the dynamic study mod or smart book assignments that you have, and we'll see you on Thursday. Okay.